East. So you all know I'm Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday. It's June 5th, 2025. Today is day 608 since October 7th of 2023. And we just received news just in the last 20 minutes or so from our board representative from the Episcopal Church that the Al-Ali Hospital was attacked again last night. There's a statement by the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem that just came out. At 10:20 a.m. Jerusalem time, Israeli forces fired inside the compound of the Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza City. This is in North Gaza. According to the initial report, 3 journalists were killed, 2 others, a father escorting his son to a surgical unit for treatment for previous injuries. In addition, this unprovoked assault against civilians wounded 30 other bystanders, and among them 4 hospital staff. And the diocese condemned the attack. They said, finally, we bid Christians and others of goodwill around the world to join us in prayers and efforts to bring speedy end to this conflict, leading to the release of all captives and the more comprehensive treatment of the wounded, the feeding of the desperately hungry, the rebuilding of the tens of thousands of homes, hundreds of public facilities that have been destroyed. Only in this way, we believe, can healing begin and the pathway towards a just and lasting peace open for all of those living in our beloved Holy Land. Now, there's been an update since that, which corrected one part of the statement, confirming that there were 2 journalists killed and 4 injured. But, you know, this story is unfolding right now. So wanted to let you know that had happened. The 3 mentioned in the statement were not journalists. 2 of them were confirmed to be journalists. 1 was a staff member. The Episcopal Church, standing with Archbishop Hossam Naoum, condemned the attack and urged the Israeli government to respect international human rights law. They will be having an event today at 10 a.m., which is right now, with Richard Sewell. I won't be offended, you know, if people on the call want to go and attend that, but he's the Dean of St. George's College. Yesterday, there was a vote at the United Nations. The UN Security Council voted on a draft resolution that demanded an immediate and unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza with respect to all parties, and the U.S. vetoed it. The U.S. said that the statement or the resolution would embolden Hamas. The resolution also called for unrestricted aid into war-ravaged Gaza. There's a 15-nation council, and the U.S. was the only one to vote against the call for the ceasefire resolution. I feel like this is a stain on our conscience, saying that the resolution would only work to embolden Hamas because it did not call for the militant group to disarm. Earlier this week, Western countries are, quote, risking losing all credibility with the rest of the world if they allow a free pass in Gaza. Those were the words of the French president, Emmanuel Macron. He said that last Friday. The EU's collective position against Israel, they're in conversation right now about whether or not there should be sanctions and what the response should be, because the Gaza humanitarian situation is getting worse and worse. And something to know is June 17th to 19th, there's an international summit at the United Nations being convened by Macron and the French and the Saudis. It's a 2-state solution peace summit at the United Nations, and Churches for Middle East Peace anticipates that we'll be engaged in some way, shape, or form in that as well. International advocates are seeking to intervene in several different ways. There are kind of lots of advocacy efforts focused on Gaza right now internationally. One of them is a Gaza flotilla called the Madeleine Gaza Flotilla. It's a 12-person crew. I'm sure you've heard of the climate activist Greta Thunberg. She's on it. The ship is expected to reach Gaza on the 7th, so in 2 days. My update's a couple days old. This is launched by the Frida Flotilla Coalition. As of June 3rd, it was 375 miles from Sicily. You'll recall that there was a former ship that actually was called the Conscience, and it was about a month ago that Israeli drones bombed it when it was off the coast of Malta. So there's significant potential that there could be violence around this flotilla. There was a flotilla in previous Gaza wars where there were interventions where there were severe injuries, and there might have even been a death. And so that's just something for us to pay close attention to. The UN spokesperson last Friday said that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is at its worst since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, and that the limited resumption of aid last week has had very, very little impact on the catastrophic situation. And wait till you hear the updates I have since last week. It's only gotten worse. On the 27th of May, the militarized distribution mechanism of food supplies began. This was where things shifted from the UN to the new US-Israel plan. Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been the distributor. They've had hubs. There were supposed to be 3 hubs or 4 hubs, I believe, but 2 were set up in the northwestern Rafah and Deir al-Balah. Since then, thousands of Palestinians reported walking towards distribution sites to receive food, but several shooting incidents resulted in mass casualties. Since May 27th, the OHCHR, Human Rights Office at the UN, said 82 Palestinians have been killed and 506 injured, reportedly while trying to reach these food distribution centers. It has been utter chaos. And the fact that people, we talked about the bread massacre last year of people being shot while they're trying to get food when they're so desperately hungry. It is like the worst, of the worst of scenarios. The ICRC field hospital in Rafah has a capacity of 60 beds. They received a mass casualty influx of 179 cases, including women and children. On June 1st, there was another mass casualty influx of 184 patients in Han Yunis. Médecins Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders, joined the mass casualty response to treat patients with serious injuries at Nasser Hospital, where people were shot from all sides by drones, helicopters, boats, tanks, and Israeli soldiers. MSF said the hospital corridors were filled with patients and blood banks are almost empty, and medical staff themselves are donating blood. On Sunday, there were 31 people killed, 170 wounded, as large crowds were seeking to receive food. And so I could go through each day on these updates. Over the weekend, desperate civilians on Saturday looted 80 aid trucks. One of the things that's happened is that there is a void of civil, police officers have been killed, or Hamas ran different civil services. And so those have been completely wiped out. And so there are no local bodies by which to govern this. And the current, mechanism by the Israelis and supported by the US, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, doesn't have the capability, to be able to operate, whereas the UN and the humanitarian groups do, and are not being allowed to. So the Israeli military said just today, this came out this morning, two bodies of Israeli American hostages who had been killed previously were just recovered from South Han Yunis in Gaza. On Tuesday, Israeli forces killed 27 people while they were at a humanitarian distribution site. The army said it fired at a few individual suspects who left the designated route. So what happens is, and this is happening throughout Gaza, what happens is if Israel says that there needs to be a designated route, anyone who goes outside of that route, regardless of if that route has been clearly communicated or not, you can imagine, the chaos, etc. Anyone who goes outside of that is considered a military combatant. So when we read in the news, a suspect, etc., it could just be someone who doesn't know what the designated route is, and they're shot at indiscriminately. So in large part, that's how many of these deaths are happening. Yesterday, the US and Israel's backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation announced that it would not give any aid at all because they had to update, organize, and improve their efficiency. They also asked the Israeli military to guide foot traffic in a way that would minimize confusion or the escalation of risk. And the IDF said that people should be prohibited from moving in areas leading to aid distribution sites and deem them as combat zones. In other words, it would be justified to kill people who go into those areas. The GHF yesterday named Reverend Dr. Johnny Moore, a former evangelical advisor to the White House during Trump's first term, as its new executive chairman. Moore previously backed Trump's proposal for the U.S. to take over the Gaza Strip. And I wanted to call your attention to a humanitarian snapshot that was released this week. You could Google this. You could find it on our website. It's called The Edge of Erasure. These snapshots, this is the 12th one. CMEP has signed on to almost all of them alongside of dozens of international aid and development agencies that are working in Gaza. This covers March 26th to May 28th. It gives the most up-to-date news, facts, statistics, case studies about the lack of access to food, water, fuel, medicine, the deepening man-made catastrophic humanitarian crisis that's happening in Gaza. In addition, annexation is accelerating in the illegally occupied West Bank and in East Jerusalem. There are violent military raids, settlement expansion. Just last week, 22 new settlements were approved by the Israeli government, intensified demolitions, mass force displacements, and the entrenchment of Israel's unlawful control. These escalating violations are not isolated, they are systematic, and they risk the erasure of Palestinians. We are literally watching, at a minimum, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in front of our very eyes. And as in large part the world, governments are doing virtually nothing to bring an end to it after more than 600 days. In yesterday's update, I read a note from a dear friend in Gaza. And he said, I won't read the whole thing, but he said, this is no accident. Humiliation is a deliberate tactic to break dignity, to make displacement inevitable. Starvation is a tool stripping away the last remnants of humanity. In recent days, starving families have walked miles to reach food aid only to be shot at by soldiers. Some have heard mocking shouts through megaphones saying, hungry Gazans, come get your food like dogs. Others were forced to strip while soldiers jeered, where is the starvation? Look at how fat they are. Of all of the horrors, nothing cuts as deep or deeper than humiliation. Some wounds inflicted in front of your children will never heal. No therapy can erase such trauma. This is not a just war. This is the systematic dehumanization of an entire people. There have been a couple of calls to action that we at Churches for Middle East Peace would invite people to engage in. These are not exclusive in terms of a list by any means, but some Palestinian women wrote a letter called Women's Voice for Gaza, a Palestinian Christian call for justice and life. And Churches for Middle East Peace was asked to sign on very early. And Still We Rise is our women's empowerment program. We have a Palestinian leadership team, and they endorsed the statement. Part of it says, we Palestinian Christian women from across historic Palestine, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, aunts, and caregivers, raise our voices as our people in Gaza face deliberate starvation. We speak from our faith and humanity, following the prophetic voices of our ancestors in Scripture who proclaimed God's justice in times of crisis. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. I'd also encourage you, if you have not, as of yet, engaged in our recent action alert. It's called Letters for Gaza. We're doing it in partnership with several other organizations. It's a U.S. coalition-led campaign that's mobilizing thousands of citizens around the U.S. to urge members of Congress to support full, unrestricted humanitarian access to Gaza and to have an immediate halt to the bombardment of civilians. Members of Congress have the power to pressure the Trump administration to use diplomatic tools to lift the blockade and to push for a permanent ceasefire. And so that Letters for Gaza campaign is active right now and also on our website. Israel has said that they would not cooperate. The Palestinian Authority tried to have a meeting with other Arab leaders this past week in Ramallah. Israel said that it was provocative and they would not allow a high-level Saudi led delegation of foreign ministers from the Arab world to enter into the occupied West Bank. And Haaretz published an article about Israeli civil society this past week saying that 82% of people in Israel support the expelling of the people of Gaza. the expulsion of Gaza residents. 56% favored expelling Palestinian citizens from the state of Israel. These figures are a sharp rise from a survey that was done in 2003. But on the other hand, there are other leaders in Israel that are speaking out. One of the strongest condemnations of Israel's ongoing offensive in Gaza came from one of its own former prime ministers, Ehud Olmert. He served from 2006 to 2009. He wrote a scathing op-ed in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz saying, "Enough is enough. Israel is committing war crimes." PBS has a transcript of the interview that they did with him. I had the privilege of meeting with Olmert this week and learning about his plan for a two-state solution. He was a significant part of a peace process negotiations with Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas. It fell through. As a prime minister, his role was quite contentious, but for him to speak out and say that Israel's committing war crimes right now is courageous. Not much news in terms of Iran nuclear talks. The Ayatollah Ali Khamenei criticized the nuclear proposals, but didn't reject the possibility. The Trump administration's kind of been going back and forth about the amount of uranium that might be allowed or not at all. There was a little kerfuffle between Witkoff and Trump this last week, where Witkoff said one thing and Trump said another. In Syria, the Islamic State last Thursday claimed responsibility for 2 bombs. Saudi and Qatar are going to put financial support behind state employees in Syria. Israel and Syria held face-to-face meetings this past week, which is unprecedented. And at the same time, just Wednesday, Israel launched the first airstrikes in Syria in nearly a month, stating it had targeted weapons belonging to the Syrian government. The U.S. military, this is quite significant, is withdrawing from Syria. We've had 8 bases there for years. We're lowering that to only 1 base, which is quite significant because analysts say it will allow for the rise of ISIS once again. And then shifting to U.S. domestic issues, we had another horrific attack against activists calling for release of hostages in Gaza. This was 8 people hospitalized with burns and other injuries after a man used what was described as a flamethrower in Boulder, Colorado. A 45-year-old witnesses said he yelled "Free Palestine" before the attack. And this is just less than 2 weeks after that gunman killed the 2 Israeli employees in Washington. An activist and friend of ours, Aziz Abu Sarah, said this about the attack. "What happened in Colorado is heartbreaking and unacceptable. We must be loud and clear. Violence against civilians is never justice. No matter the cause, no matter the views, it won't bring peace. It only fuels more hate. We don't heal pain by spreading it. We don't build justice with bloodshed." Prosecutors charged that man with a hate crime and state charges of attempted murder. This year, the Hajj pilgrimage is underway. There are many mechanisms in place to try to prevent the deaths of people from heat stroke. There's been a crackdown and some changes in some of the rules. The Hajj pilgrimage is going to the Saudi city of Mecca as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Children under 12 are not allowed to go this year. Last year, 1,300 people died because of heat. And so, there are many, many things being done to try to prevent that from happening this year. The price of the Hajj can range from $4,000 to $20,000. But pray alongside of our Muslim brothers and sisters during this holy time, as many of them are making a pilgrimage. The goal or pillar of Islam is that people would go to Mecca at least once in their lifetime, a sacred rite for devout Muslims. This week, I did highlight what's happening in Egypt on St. Catherine's Monastery, Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 commandments from God. On May 28th, there was a ruling about the ownership of the land that St. Catherine's Monastery sits on. Rumors started to circulate. And then there was this decision that was made on May 28th. It was a 160-page text, quite complex. But essentially, there was in this text, the statement that the lands are considered state property. And so Archbishop Elpidophoros of the Greek Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church in Greece and around the world, and we alongside of them are protesting that decision to protect the presence of Christians. The ruling did say that the monks could continue to operate the monastery, but it would really commercialize the location. And there are many things that are problematic from a cultural, religious freedom standpoint in that regard. CMEP put out a press release about that this week, standing alongside and emphasizing His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros' statement, saying that the enduring legacy of faith, scholarship, and interreligious harmony is one of the most critical aspects of the monastery, which has, been considered, it's one of the oldest monasteries in the world. And so calling upon religious leaders, international organizations, and people of faith to advocate for its preservation and to work collectively to ensure that the sacred institution considers to inspire and unite people for generations to come. Finally, I wanted to let you know I had an academic article that was released this week entitled The 2023-24 Israel-Hamas War, What Jewish Trauma and Genocide in Gaza Taught Me About Collective Liberation. This was published by Christian Relief, Development and Advocacy. It took more than a year for this article to be written. It's really much more of, I was going to say a journal of sorts, but the summary of it says that it's about peacemaking, resolution to conflict and violence, but it talks a lot about the history, what happened actually on October 7th and in the days following. It addresses Christian responses as well. And my hope and prayer is that the physical constraints of pain, violence, and suffering here on this earth, that by the grace of God, we would be liberated from those, that Gaza and so many who are suffering would experience liberation, but that also we would experience liberation in our souls from that which breaks us and damages us and causes pain. So might the Holy Spirit, divine comforter, come and enter into those broken places within us, in Palestine, in Israel, in the Middle East, and around the world. Might God go before us in the name of Christ. Amen.